Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Zay Jones, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about my Week 17 waiver wire targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 17. Again, for many of us, this is the defining week. Win or go home, capture a 2021 fantasy football championship, or forever be forgotten as the second place team in your league. And in order to go ahead and help us win Week 17 contest, we have to go ahead and perhaps go to the waiver wire, pick up players that are going to give us the best chance in doing so. With the variety of injuries and other cases in which players may be missing, many of us will be shorthanded. But in order to go ahead and fight off the variety of different factors that may be impeding our potential for success this week, hopefully the waiver wire will be able to set you up and get you guys a W this week. Again, I'll talk about players and prospects that are currently being rostered in less than 40% of leagues. Oftentimes, players that are rostered in less than 10% of leagues, less than 5% of leagues, in order to give you the best advantage. I know some of you play in a 12, 14, 16 team league, so hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of an idea as to what is potentially available. And outside of that, I'll give you guys my thought process, the statistics that justify my reasoning as to why I value specific players as such, and that'll serve as today's episode. Before we begin, I want to remind you, if you guys have not yet already, subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. It certainly does help support. And of course, I'm making fantasy football content until the end of the 2021 season, even past week 18 to the NFL playoffs. A lot of content coming there via Underdog Fantasy. If you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, again, even if your fantasy season has ended or perhaps may end next week and you want to continue to play fantasy football, Underdog Fantasy is the best way of doing it. This past weekend, I put together a slew of pick'em slips, and boy, did I find some success, and in some points made some big mistakes. Let's go ahead and review exactly what happened this past weekend. Now, I talked about this on my Hidden Gems episode on Friday, but let's go ahead and let's present to you some of the pick'em slips that I put together. The first one was Zach Ertz having more receptions than Jonathan Taylor. I told you guys on the Hidden Gems episode that that was the automatic, and I was going to include this slip or this specific rivals matchup in every single contest that I put forth going into the weekend. So obviously I attached it to Carson Wentz under on his rushing yards. Boom, was able to get 3 times my money on a $5 bet. No big deal. Then I followed it up with another one, attached Zach Ertz. I thought T. Higgins was going to have a great week, and so he did. And then I went ahead and I added it to an even bigger contest in which I thought, you know what, the Baltimore Ravens secondary are certainly in trouble. Let's go ahead and let's bet on the Cincinnati Bengals, putting up a quick number on them. And bada boom, 4 picks, 10 times my money, $10 bet. Great to do. Now, the final bet, and the one that hurt me the most this weekend, was unfortunately I missed out on a big chunk of change here. Underdog Fantasy had an incredible promotion in which instead of putting together a 5-leg pick'em and only 20 times in your money, it was 50 times if you included Josh Allen in it, and got that one also correct. Unfortunately, I went under on total yards because I thought to myself, no Beasley, they didn't have Gabriel Davis. Maybe they weren't going to have a great game, but holy moly, did they, and am I hurting because of it? I was able to add a couple other guys here and get a great slip overall, but unfortunately came short. But either way, I'm telling you guys, there's a lot of fun to have. There's a lot of money to be made. For those of you who are interested, check out Underdog Fantasy. Link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew today, and Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. So if you want to put in 100, they'll match your 100 and get you ready to go for this upcoming weekend's contest and perhaps later tonight's game, Miami Dolphins versus the New Orleans Saints. Check that out. Thank you. All right. Now that we've covered that, let's talk about our Week 17 waiver wire targets, beginning with the running back position and beginning with the thumbnail of today's video. We have ourselves Jordan Howard, Philadelphia Eagles running back. And our number 2 for this week is, in fact, another Philadelphia Eagles running back, Boston Scott. Like I talk about it every week, the only way a player gains immense value, especially late in the season at this current point, is via an injury. And Miles Sanders, he did break his hand in yesterday's contest. For those of you who had him, you may be wondering why he was such an underwhelming performance in a blowout game. Well, it was because he broke his hand and left the game. Now, all in all, I think to myself, Jordan Howard and Boston Scott, they both have incredible value, but let's go ahead and let's talk about how much value they particularly have and why I prefer Jordan Howard over Boston Scott. Now, though Boston Scott was able to score a touchdown in Sunday's game against the New York Giants and get himself 10.1 fantasy points, there was still a little bit of a, evenness between the distribution of opportunity between Jordan Howard and Boston Scott. Boston Scott had himself 12 total rushing attempts, no targets overall. Jordan Howard had himself 9 rushing attempts, 4 targets, 2 receptions. So pretty much a total of 13 opportunities to 12 opportunities. pretty even in my book. In terms of overall snap percentages, very even as well. But when I look at when Miles Sanders was missing and went to the injured reserve earlier this season, between weeks 8 through 10, I wanted to go ahead and see between these two running backs who had the most overall opportunity and who found the most success. And I found that it was Jordan Howard. From weeks 8 through 10, when Miles Sanders was not in this backfield, Jordan Howard was averaging 13.03 fantasy points per game and had a total of 41 rushing attempts in those 3 contests, while Boston Scott was averaging 11.17 fantasy points per game with only 33 total rushing attempts. Sure, the opportunity in terms of touches, not that big of a disparity, as it was only 8 total rushing attempts in terms of the difference, but 2 fantasy points per game going in the direction of a Jordan Howard, and him, of course, being a bulldozing running back that they like to use. When in fact Miles Sanders is not there, he of course is the lead back, and that's what I kind of anticipate to see this upcoming week. They take on the Washington football team. The last time they took them on was in week 15, and guess what? In week 15 against them, Miles Sanders and Jordan Howard, they combined for 200 total rushing yards against that defense. I think there's a lot of success to be had against this Washington football team, and both these guys should be picked up as such and potentially played as running back options. Moving on to Ogunbowale. Now, unfortunately, like I mentioned, injuries are going to occur, and when they do, another player is going to step up and potentially gain that value, and that's what we saw. Unfortunately, James Robinson, in an incredible matchup against the New York Jets defense, tore his Achilles. Now, besides just this season, this is going to affect next year, because again, the return of another player in that backfield who also tore their Achilles, who is Travis Etienne, former Clemson running back, and of course teammate of Trevor Lawrence. They're going to have a little bit of a connection there, and they'll probably have the advantage of starting for majority of the first month of the 2022 season. So this doesn't bode well for James Robinson. But either way, in terms of closing out the 2021 year, taking on the New England Patriots, yes, it's a tougher matchup per se, but I'm not too worried about it. Ogunbowale has found a lot of success, especially this last week. He had himself 14.2 fantasy points, 17 rushing attempts for 57 yards and a touchdown, 2 catches on 4 targets for 15 yards. All in all, found success. And this isn't the first time that he has had to step up when James Robinson went down with an injury. In fact, in 2020, weeks 16 and 17, he had to do the same. In those 2 weeks, he had himself a 9.3 fantasy point performance and a 9.2 fantasy point performance. Overall, in both games, was able to get himself 14 rushing attempts. In one game, 71 rushing yards, and the other 50 rushing yards. Got himself, of course, a lot of receptions out of this backfield, as that is what he's primarily a back that serves as a third down option. So overall, Ogunbowale, not a bad choice going into this upcoming weekend's matchup. Moving on to Rex Burkhead, our number 4. It was unbelievable to see that Rex Burkhead went for 27.9 fantasy points. It's insane that he went for 149 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, which is literally the single most fantasy points the Los Angeles Chargers have given up to a running back this season. And they've played against Mixon, Najee Harris, Damian Harris, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, Zeke. Even Pollard had a good game. Clyde Edwards went for 100 yards on these guys. Even Kareem Hunt had himself a 2-touchdown game. It didn't matter. Rex Burkhead had the greatest performance against this defense this season, and I don't think anybody's going to top it. Now, the thing that kind of gives Rex Burkhead an advantage going into this upcoming weekend is, of course, is that David Johnson's most likely going to miss once again. And, prior to this past weekend, in weeks 13 and 14, we had seen Rex Burkhead be given the opportunity when David Johnson's not in this backfield. And in those 2 games, he was able to put up a total of only 13.6 fantasy points. So he was averaging about 6 fantasy points per game when there was no David Johnson in the backfield. And then all of a sudden, in week 16 of our 2021 fantasy football season, he decided to go for 27 fantasy points. Unbelievable, but hey, if he's going to be the starter, he's going to be given the majority of touches, by all means, we have to follow and pick him up and use him potentially going into this week. Moving on to Keyshawn Vaughn. Now, the only reason I have confidence here isn't because of the fact that he had a huge run for a touchdown, but mainly because I don't expect Le'Veon Bell to be a viable option in this backfield. I honestly believe that Keyshawn Vaughn is going to get the touches, and especially considering they take on the New York Jets this week. He's only rostered in 1% of leagues, and he went, and had himself a pretty decent game. He could end up getting a lot of garbage time carries in that second half. This team, this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team, which is, of course, dealing with more and more injuries every single week, they're trying to stay healthy. They're trying to keep their, prime prospects out of harm's way. And that's what they're potentially going to do in the second half. Ronald Jones probably will have himself a good first half, first 3 quarters, but in the fourth quarter, it'll be all Keyshawn Vaughn. And of course, he'll be dominating this defense that has given up the most points to opposing running backs all season long. Not a bad option there. Moving on to our final running back, it is Derrick Gore. Now, if in fact Darrell Williams is available in your league, he typically isn't, considering he's already rostered in 60% of leagues right now. But if he's available, he would take priority here. But currently, with Clyde Edwards-Helaire going down with a little bit of a collarbone / shoulder injury, nothing has been confirmed in terms of him breaking his collarbone, so he should probably only miss a week here. But Derrick Gore, playing against Cincinnati Bengals, a running back that is only rostered in 2% of leagues, coming off of a performance of 11.9 fantasy points. Not a bad one, especially considering Darrell Williams, he himself had himself a 10 fantasy point performance. We could see a little bit of a split here. I know it was a blowout, and that's why Derrick Gore got his touches. But again, just wanted to mention a running back just in case you're in need of one. Moving on, let's go to the wide receiver position, beginning with KJ Osborn. Again, another injury that occurred this last weekend, Adam Thielen. He unfortunately re-injured his high ankle sprain, and he was out for that game midway through. He was having himself a pretty good performance prior to that injury re-aggravating itself, but all in all, KJ Osborn rostered in 34% of leagues. If he's available, I want to have him on roster. He's coming off of another week of having 7 targets, 5 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown, 15.3 fantasy points. By all means, he needs to be rostered, especially considering they take on the Green Bay Packers. It should be a higher scoring matchup between these two teams. Moving on to Joshua Palmer. If, in fact, we do not see the immediate return of Mike Williams and or Jalen Guyton, there is a very good chance that Josh Palmer, of course, finds himself more and more opportunity. You know, to be honest, Justin Herbert is such a great quarterback that regardless of whether it is Jalen Guyton or Josh Palmer, both these guys have scored a consistent amount over the last month of the season. And as long as they're going to be in this lineup, by all means, they will find the opportunity and find the end zone. A player that is only rostered in 5% of leagues right now should be paid attention to just a little bit more than we typically are. Moving on to Isaiah McKenzie. Now, of course, with Cole Beasley out and Gabriel Davis out, I thought that Emmanuel Sanders would be the play. And unfortunately, Emmanuel Sanders, despite, Josh Allen throwing a dart right into his hands, hitting him in the chest, Emmanuel Sanders decided to drop a touchdown. Nonetheless, Isaiah McKenzie had 12 targets, 11 catches, 125 yards and a touchdown, 23.9 fantasy points in a week against one of the better defenses in the National Football League. Put an incredible number up against the New England Patriots, only rostered in 1% of leagues. I'm thinking to myself, there's no way that Isaiah McKenzie can have such an incredible performance even with the return of Cole Beasley and Gabriel Davis, and disappear from this entire scheme. There's no way they're going to disappear him and fade him out. He's far too valuable, and the fact that he was able to perform so well, you might as well go ahead and take a shot for him and see what comes of it. Moving on to Allen Lazard. Again, if Marquez Valdes-Scantling is going to be out for another week here, then, of course, Allen Lazard, another one of these red zone threats, continues to find himself in the end zone. Had himself 12.8 total fantasy points, rostered in 24% of leagues. Sure, he probably isn't as widely available as some of these other prospects, but if he, in fact, is available and Marquez Valdes-Scantling isn't going to return against Minnesota, like I was mentioning before in regards to KJ Osborn, this should be a higher scoring game between these two teams that, of course, have great offenses. Moving on to Zay Jones. Now, Zay Jones has been incredible in the last 2 games. Now, I know Bryan Edwards missed this last weekend's game, but in terms of his overall opportunity, 9 targets, 8 targets in the last 2 games that have followed with 6 receptions in each game, over 50 yards in each game, and 9.7 and 8.0 fantasy points. Not a bad option in my opinion. He's currently only rostered to 1% of leagues. If in fact you're in need of a running back desperately, Zay Jones potentially still out there for you. Moving on to our final option, it is Kadarius Toney, rostered in 22% of leagues. He, in the last 2 games, has had 12 targets and 9 targets that have led to 7 and 4 receptions. Overall, not the greatest fantasy point contribution, 7.5 and 4.8. Obviously, this is a rookie that has dealt with an incredible amount of injuries this season, and hopefully once he returns and has himself another week under his belt, upcoming here against the Chicago Bears, we might be able to find ourselves some success here. Of course, if he's going to continue to lead this team in terms of total targets as of late, then by all means, I may want to go ahead and take a flyer on him. All right, moving on to the tight end and quarterback section of today's video. Let's begin with some tight ends, beginning with number 1, Gerald Everett. Again, I don't want to mention a tight end that is only rostered in 0% of league. I mean, Bates from the Washington football team, maybe he's a guy you want to take a chance on, but still, he still has the potential of Ricky Seals-Jones stealing some opportunity here and there. Either way, we'll talk about that later this week when we talk about tight ends. But my primary focus is currently on Gerald Everett, only rostered in 42% of leagues, probably already taken in your league, considering I've mentioned him every week for the last 2 months here. But either way, just wanted to go ahead, reintroduce the potential of Gerald Everett coming off of a 14.8 fantasy point performance. The 4 prior performances to this last week in terms of overall fantasy point contributions and a half PPR. 8.0, 9.0, negative 1.3, and then 12.2. As of late, besides that one negative point performance, this man has but 8+ fantasy points every single week, and that is why, of all the tight ends that are available, we got to go after guys that we know are going to be able to put up points. rather than some guys that aren't rostered in very many percent of leagues, and we're taking a really big risk with them. Moving on to Kmet, again, like I mentioned, 34% rostered, coming off of a 6.9 fantasy point performance. Unfortunately, Jimmy Graham was the guy that stole a touchdown. Again, I kind of anticipated it. I talked about it on my Thursday video. Kmet pretty much dominates between the 20s. Anything inside the 20-yard line, it is all Jimmy Graham, and that is the risk we have to take. But either way, still has a lot of value going into this week. Foster Moreau, if in fact Darren Waller doesn't play again, Foster Moreau has been great as of the last 2 weeks. This last week, 8.7 fantasy points, caught all 4 targets for 67 yards. The week prior in week 15, 9 targets, 7 catches, 65 yards, and 10 fantasy points. Not a bad option if Darren Waller misses once again here. Moving on to the quarterback conversation. The Chicago Bears, they play against the New York Giants, which is an incredible matchup. But specifically Justin Fields, if he's able to play, I know he was out with an ankle injury, but if he's able to play, only 23% rostered, I think he has a great chance of being a top 12, top 16 quarterback at very least. Based on the matchup and his recent performances, it really does build confidence in my eye, because in the last 4 starts for Justin Fields, he has put up 285 passing yards and a touchdown, 224, 2 touchdowns, 291 in a touchdown, 175 in a touchdown. He's averaging 19.67 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Also averaging 64 rushing yards per game in those 4 starts as of late. A great overall performer to say the very least. Another player that has been incredible in his last 4 starts, Davis Mills, only rostered in 3% of leagues, taking on the San Francisco 49ers. This team, the Houston Texans, they have won just as many games as they did last season. And last year they had Deshaun Watson at quarterback. Now they have Davis Mills / Tyrod Taylor. Imagine that. But either way, Davis Mills in his last 4 starts, 254 yards, 2 touchdowns, 209, 2 touchdowns, 331 in a touchdown, 310 and 2 touchdowns. He's averaging 17.76 fantasy points per game in the last 4 overall starts for his career. A great overall performer in my opinion. And if you're desperate for a quarterback, not a bad play at all. Moving on, Trey Lance. With Jimmy Garoppolo having sustained an injury on that Thursday night game, the quote that I read was specifically, Jimmy Garoppolo suffered a quote-unquote more significant injury to his right thumb than just a sprain. Now, if that's going to be something that potentially holds Jimmy Garoppolo out, by all means, they take on the Houston Texans. Trey Lance is only rostered in 12% of leagues. For those of you who have held on to him, this may be the time in your championship Sunday game to potentially take advantage of Trey Lance. Moving on, let's talk about defenses and special teams, beginning with the Chicago Bears taking on the New York Giants. The New York Giants have given up 16 fantasy points to their last 2 opponents, the Dallas Cowboys defense and Philadelphia Eagles defense. So as long as they're giving up double-digit points to opposing defenses, and they have to take on the Chicago Bears, who are only rostered in 16% of leagues, they're my number 1 for waiver wires this week. Moving on, we have Cleveland Browns taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't know if the Pittsburgh Steelers even know what universe they're in. They don't know how to score in the first half. They have demonstrated that over the last couple weeks. And in my opinion, this is a matchup in which Cleveland typically finds a lot of success, or at least prevents Pittsburgh from scoring. Moving on, we have the Seattle Seahawks defense taking on the Detroit Lions. If in fact Jared Goff is back, sure, there's a little bit more of a conversation as to why we would pivot away from the Seattle Seahawks. But if he's not, and it's Tim Boyle, I think the Seahawks defense certainly do play pretty well and could cause some trouble for a backup quarterback like Tim Boyle. Moving on to the kicker conversation. A lot of these guys have been seen before, but they still somehow, some way, are still not rostered in very many leagues. Only 28% of leagues have Evan McPherson on roster. This is a guy that in the last 6 weeks, in the last 6 games specifically, has been averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game at the kicker position. Anytime you're getting double-digit points every single week from your kicker, that is at times outproducing your wide receiver 2, your RB2, your tight end. It's more valuable than those positions. So we got to treat it as such. The next player that I wanted to mention is another player that has been averaging 12.75 fantasy points per game over his last 8 games. It is Jake Elliott, only rostered in 20% of leagues. Again, playing against the Washington football team, this should be a blowout, and it should be a game in which Jake Elliott should find himself some success, as he has over the last 2 months of the season. The final kicker I wanted to mention is a player that, if in fact these 2 are already taken, you can go ahead and go after Riley Patterson. Riley Patterson of the Detroit Lions, a former Vikings kicker. His picture on Yahoo at least is a Viking. Either way, he's currently rostered in 0% of leagues. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks. This is a kicker that in the last 4 games for the Detroit Lions has been averaging 10.25 fantasy points per game, has been able to surpass 10 fantasy points in 3 out of the last 4 games. Overall, Riley Patterson, not a bad option. Either way, these are our Week 17 waiver wire targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Hopefully, this kind of gives you some insight as to where we're going. Obviously, a lot of injuries are going to dictate the waiver wire and the structure of it going into the final weeks of our season. Tomorrow, we'll talk about our top 36 running back rankings. We'll talk about matchups at the position and all of that going into week 17. Enjoy the Monday night game between the Miami Dolphins and the New Orleans Saints. Of course, check out Underdog Fantasy today. There's a link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew, and Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. If I'm able to put together some pick'em slips and find success, then by all means, I have enough confidence that you guys will be able to too. So go ahead and check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. All right, until next time, thank you everybody for watching. Click the like button down below, and I'll see you guys. Peace.